Welcome back, Focus Learners. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here for today's explainer. Look, if you're learning Portuguese, you already know the deal. Verbs are the engine of the language, right? They drive literally every single sentence. But let's be totally honest for a second. We've all been there. You're sitting at a desk, staring at this massive 50-row verb conjugation table until your eyes totally cross and the words just blur into a meaningless soup of vowels. It's exhausting, and quite frankly, it's really not how our brains naturally pick up language. So today, we're throwing out the rote memorization. No drilling tables. Instead, we're going to master the underlying mechanics of 5 foundational Portuguese verbs. By the end of this explainer, you won't just know how to conjugate them. You'll actually understand exactly how to use them as structural building blocks to exponentially grow your vocabulary.
But before we break down those mechanics, let me pose a quick question directly to you, or as we say in Portuguese, você. What do the everyday actions of studying, working, and building actually have in common when we translate them into Portuguese? Take a quick second to really think about that. On the surface, they're completely different actions, but grammatically? Well, they hold the secret to unlocking 2 distinct patterns that govern thousands of other words. Just keep that little mystery in the back of your mind as we start breaking things down today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today's lesson, moving systematically from basic rules right into real-world conversation. First, os verbos essenciais. Second, regras de conjugação. Third, verbos na prática. Fourth, formação de palavras. And finally, o seu próximo passo.
All right, starting with section 1, os verbos essenciais, or the essential verbs.
So, we can categorize our essential verbs for today into 2 distinct camps. Looking at the left side, we've got 4 incredibly common verbs. Estudar for to study, trabalhar for to work, falar for to speak, and imaginar for to imagine. Notice how they all end in R? That tells us they belong to the first conjugation. And you know, the really beautiful thing about these R verbs is that they are completely regular. They act kind of like reliable math equations. Once you know the formula, you just plug and play, and it works every single time without fail. But then, look over on the right side. Sitting all by itself is construir, to build. It ends in ir, placing it in the third conjugation, and it's carrying a little secret. It's irregular. It just doesn't quite play by the same strict mathematical rules as the others.
Moving right along to section 2, regras de conjugação, or conjugation rules.
You see, recognizing patterns is just infinitely more effective than blindly memorizing tables. Our R verbs have absolutely 0 exceptions in their regular pattern. You literally just chop off the R ending from the infinitive and add your standard present tense endings. Boom! Fixed, unbreakable pattern. Now let's contrast that perfectly predictable pattern with construir. Why on earth is it considered irregular in the present indicative tense? Well, the source material tells us it's actually all about phonetics. It's not trying to trick you. Think about it. If you followed the strict regular rule to say I build, which would be eu construo, the U and O vowels would clash really awkwardly in your mouth. Portuguese is a melodic language, so it slightly alters the root of the verb purely to maintain a correct, smooth sound when spoken out loud. It's all about vocal flow, not arbitrary grammar punishment. And once you understand that why, the irregularity suddenly makes perfect, logical sense.
Okay, section 3, verbos na prática, verbs in practice.
Theory is wonderful, but let's be real. Language actually lives in conversation. Let's look at a totally realistic dialogue between 2 colleagues, Jean and Maria, just to ground this grammar in tangible, everyday communication. Jean starts off by asking, Você ainda trabalha naquela empresa de engenharia? Meaning, do you still work at that engineering company? Notice exactly how the verb trabalha is functioning here. Because trabalhar is perfectly regular, João just takes the dictionary infinitive, chops off that final R, leaving the root trabalha, which maps perfectly to the você, or you, form. This happens in a fraction of a second in your brain, but understanding this mechanical drop of the R is absolutely key to unlocking spoken, everyday questions.
Now, check out Maria's response and notice how the irregular verb operates. She replies, sim, and agora nós estamos construindo novo shopping no centro. Yes, and now we are building a new mall downtown. She's using construir in the gerund form, construindo, which is essentially the exact equivalent of adding ing in English. It brilliantly expresses this fluid, ongoing action happening right now. As you can see, even irregular verbs lean into these highly recognizable patterns when describing continuous action.
So, João's impressed. He says, "Get it go. Eu vou estudar arquitetura no próximo ano para poder falar sobre projetos com você." That's cool. I'm going to study architecture next year so I can talk about projects with you.
And this brings us to an absolutely crucial concept, verb stacking. Look at how effortlessly João stacks vou, meaning I go, with estudar, to study. Guys, this is the ultimate language cheat code for learners. When you stack verbs like this to talk about the future, you only need to conjugate the first tiny helper verb, in this case vou. You can then leave the big action verbs, estudar and falar, entirely untouched in their basic dictionary infinitive forms. It is just an incredibly liberating hack. You really don't have to panic about complex future tense endings. You literally just use your helper verb and drop the infinitive right next to it. They're predictable blocks and incredibly easy to string together.
Finally, Maria concludes this exchange warmly. Consigo imaginar você sendo excelente arquiteto. I can imagine you being an excellent architect. Now, what's really fascinating here is that imaginar is an abstract mental concept. But Portuguese grammar, it doesn't care whether an action is highly physical, like pouring concrete for a building, or purely mental, like imagining a future career. The language treats them exactly the same way. The predictable, reliable R math still perfectly applies regardless of the meaning of the word.
Let's move to section 4 and see how this builds. Formação de palavras, or word formation.
All right, this is where we go beyond basic sentences and get into a true vocabulary expansion hack. I want you to start thinking of verbs not just as isolated action words, but as seeds. Our source texts point out that by simply taking the root of these core verbs and adding specific suffixes, you can instantly multiply your vocabulary. Think of it kind of like this. The suffix sal is essentially the Portuguese equivalent of the English tation, like in communication or action. The suffix dor represents a person or thing doing the action, heavily mirroring the English like a baker or a worker. The suffix ante is similar to the English ant or ing, and also gives you adjectives ending in ois, like famous or continuous. By learning just one verb root, you're essentially getting 4 or 5 related words entirely for free. How cool is that?
Now, what's really interesting about this is how it works practically. Let's map it out using the verb hesitar, which means to hesitate. You take that root, plug in the suffix, and you instantly get the noun hesitação, hesitation. It's literally that simple. Let's try another one. Dominar, to dominate. Add the dor suffix, and you immediately get the adjective dominador, dominating. This right here is the climax of your vocabulary strategy. The theoretical suffixes we just broke down are your golden keys. If you confidently know the base verb, you have the architectural power to accurately engineer the noun and the adjective on the fly during a conversation. It completely turns learning one word into learning an entire linguistic family. Which brings us to section 5. O seu próximo passo, your next step.
So we've journeyed all the way from identifying simple, predictable, regular verbs and decoding the logic of one phonetic, irregular verb, straight through to engineering complex nouns and adjectives. You now possess the blueprint. So I'm going to leave you with a provocative challenge. Agora é a sua vez. Now it's your turn. I want you to pick an English verb that you use every single day. Translate it into Portuguese. Then apply what we just learned. Try attaching one of those powerful suffixes to turn that verb into a brand new noun or adjective. Build a sentence about your day, your job, or what you're imagining for the future. Don't just memorize Portuguese, right? Engineer it. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep building.